Now, I was raised in the Salvation Army, and those of you who don't know that the Salvation Army is actually a break-off of the Wesleyan Methodist Church, and very lovingly brought up in that community. And one of the things that community provided for me was an early love of books and reading and Scripture. And I remember one time being in the hospital in 14th Street, New York, and it was my first conscious experience of being alone and away from my mother and my father. And my godmother had brought me one of those big old bulky illustrated children's Bible stories. And I even before I could read, I loved engaging with books. And in that hospital room, I found the story of Samuel. What struck me is here's a story about another little boy alone at night, very lonely. That's me. It was a wonderful introduction to my love of Scripture and my understanding of God. That was my foundational experience with God, because in that story, God reveals God's self to this other little boy in what always seemed to me this co-conspiratorial manner. Children need best friends, someone to confide in, someone to take their problems to. This was God for me as a little boy. The God who said, I have a world for you outside these confines, outside this hospital bed, outside these limitations. Now, this was the friend who was there in that dark, lonely night, in that really ugly little hospital room on 14th Street. But with all my physical limitations, I grew up in a very strong Christian community that always reaffirmed God's love for me and my place in that community. Now, when I reached my teenage years, I'd grown out of some of my physical limitations. I began to be able to play with some of the other little boys. I was able to wrestle and run and roughhouse. And it was wonderful to be one of the guys. It was a gift from God to have that physicality. Now, my life still revolved around church, but by this time, our family was involved in a local Pentecostal church, which is a little bit more fundamentalist than the Salvation Army. As a teenager, I began to realize that I was just a little different. I wondered why I wasn't responding to my high school girlfriend the way that the other guys were responding to theirs. And unfortunately, at about 14 or 15, I got a hold of a little book by Tim LaHaye. Anybody know who Tim LaHaye is? The title of his pseudo-Freudian damaging little book was called The Unhappy Gays. Well, 14, 15 years old. Mr. LaHaye presented to this young man a very pathological system for overcoming homosexuality. Now, Tim LaHaye was a man of God. And of course, what he wrote, he used Scripture. Okay, I copied down what I believe was a 20-step program for overcoming homosexuality at 14 years old, and in code, because if anybody opened my Bible, I really didn't want them to figure out what in the world it was there for. Tim LaHaye, unfortunately, from my experience with that book, took my relationship with God, the friend who was my co-conspirator in that hospital bed, and twisted my relationship with God. God became a judgmental father, a disapproving judgmental father, and I believe, as a Christian, that if only I yielded myself, if only I was good enough, if only I yielded myself more to Jesus, if I prayed enough, if I witnessed enough, then these feelings would go away, God would bless me in ministry, and maybe God and I could be friends again. Now, in my junior year in high school, being the roughneck kind of daring kid that I was at that time, I was in an impromptu wrestling match with one of my friends, and I received a blow to my head. This blow to my head wound me in the hospital. I went into what is called a status epilepticus, which is basically a series of grand mal seizures, one after another. Now, having those seizure experiences, I woke up in the hospital with the muscles in my legs totally torn apart, being unable to walk and frightened beyond belief. 2 weeks in that hospital bed, being unable to move, God came again in the way that God always does. But this time, having nothing but my Bible with me, God took this teenager and drew me back into the story of Samuel. But in this reading, at this time in my life, what struck me, apart from the friendship of God and Samuel, was the advice of the old priest Eli, who to Samuel, because Samuel's having problems recognizing the voice of God. Scripture says, therefore Eli said to Samuel, go lie down, and if he calls you, you shall say, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. In that hospital bed, God took the fear and graciously told me, all things work together for good. Follow where I would lead. God held me. Now my friend became my true parent. For the first year out of the hospital, I was very unsure of myself. The doctors were trying different neurological medications, Tegretol, Dilantin, something to get the seizures under control. I had difficulty crossing streets because of feelings of panic and concern. It was a very weak time, a very frightening time, but also it was one of the most blessed times because my faith community at the time overwhelmed me with their support and their love. I developed ministry. I was able to teach and I was able to preach on the occasional Sundays. And with my ties still to the Salvation Army, we did feeding programs and children's outreach. And it was a wonderfully spiritually enriching time in weakness.